Seelie or Unseelie? Which court? Do they have blue or orange morality? Playing the Fae can be tricky. It's been more than once that I've seen them turn into a haha so random meme of a character, or even worse, just another regular normal guy. Ew. So today, we're going to be breaking down some systems that can help you play your Fae in a way that makes them feel fantastical, otherworldly, or even a little bit dangerous. And then I'm going to show you how to create some from scratch, or even a boxed mix if you catch my drift. So let's talk about how to bring your Fae to life. The first place most people start when they're creating Fae NPCs or characters is deciding if they're Seelie or Unseelie. And this isn't a problem itself. The real problem is that most people equate Seelie to good and Unseelie to bad, which doesn't really make for the most interesting of characters, even if it is more or less folklore accurate. Personally, my favorite breakdown of Seelie versus Unseelie comes from Changeling the Dreaming, and in that system they separate Seelie as protectors and upholders of Fae tradition versus the Unseelie, who are catalysts of change. So the Seelie Fae are preoccupied with things like honor, virtue, loyalty, beauty, and they're more likely to protect mortals, which still doesn't mean that their idea of protection is necessarily good, but we can talk about that in a second. And the Unseelie Fae are prone to following their whims and passions. They're more rebellious, and they're likely to think that things like change are good, or that honor is a lie that shackles you and keeps you from things that are in your best interest. So again, not good versus evil, but you could still see where an Unseelie Fae would set off more alarm bells, while a Seelie Fae might lull people into a false sense of security. There's nuance. For example, if we have a Fae who's a curious stranger, if you're playing them as a Seelie Fae, they might come across as adorable and whimsical, like a puppy that can suddenly talk to their humans, so they just can't stop asking them questions and trying to show them all the things they think are cool and that their humans would like. But as an Unseelie, you might portray them as more unnerving in nature. Their energies might be focused on what specifically interests them about a specific mortal. And maybe they'd go as far as to take certain liberties, like cutting off some of a druid's vine-like hair so that they can just braid it into their own. They're not being bad or purposefully intimidating. They're just going after what they want. Or how about a Fae that's a deal maker? I have a whole video on making Fae deals and bargains, and I'll make sure to link to that below. But again, a Seelie and Unseelie Fae are going to have very different energies when it comes to this archetype. While an Unseelie version of this might read more as a traditional hag, and therefore evoke that sense of danger, a Seelie version of this archetype might have a godmother-esque feel to them. They might be more generous with their deals, and only ask for things that ensure that the mortals they're helping stay on the correct path. You know, the one they decided for them. So, what happens if she thinks her godchildren are being a little bit too wayward? What if they're straying from her path of values and virtues? Because there's literally a line in Changeling the Dreaming about how sometimes death is the only path to erase marks of dishonor. So, hopefully you can see where this gets a little bit more complex than good fairy versus bad fairy. And so some people just stick with this, the Seelie and Unseelie courts, and sometimes they'll refer to them as the summer or light court and then the winter or gloaming court. But there's just this duality. And some RPGs expand on this a bit with the idea of seasonal alignments as power sources rather than being true courts. And that's fine, I guess. But here at Stephanie Plays Games HQ, we believe that more is always better! So personally, I like having Seelie and Unseelie as kind of these overarching ideologies, and then incorporating different courts as more formal places of belonging. And that's because I can never resist a chance to add more and more factions into my campaigns. I have a video where I talk more at length about fleshing them out and using them to create more intense sessions, so I'll include a link to that below as well. But I definitely always incorporate the 4 seasonal courts as my starting place when I end up doing this. And so in most cases, spring and summer are largely made up of Seelie Fae, autumn and winter largely Unseelie. But again, there can and should be outliers of each at the different courts. These aren't meant to be monolithic ideologies. And one of the nice things about adding these courts is that it adds these layers of unknowable energy to the Fey. Because once you think you understand one Fey, you may meet another in the same court, but with very different ideals. And that can be really jarring for players who assume that they found their footing in here. And the way I usually approach courts is by incorporating another Changeling RPG, Changeling the Lost. This game has my favorite expression of these seasonal courts. I usually draw from it regardless of what RPG I'm playing. But the thing is in Changeling the Lost, it's the changelings themselves that have these court affiliations, the ones that have escaped from Arcadia, the land of the Fey. But I straight up appropriate them for the Fey instead. And that's because instead of making these seasons something more like set dressing, which is often the case in a lot of different RPGs, Changeling the Lost really gives you more ideas for what goals and what means of achieving them each of these courts might take. So in Changeling the Lost, changelings from the Spring Court focus on dealing with their trauma because, like, changelings are kidnapped peoples. But they deal with their trauma through things like denial and coping mechanisms, like constantly occupying themselves with big parties and galas, and just really living a life of excess. They believe the best way to get revenge on their captors is to live big and live well. So if we were to give that type of person a dark mirror and use that to create a Fey that belongs to this court, we might have them be Fey that are obsessive, controlling, and just sort of hyper-hedonistic in a way that's incredibly harmful to mortals. And while you, a mere mortal yourself, might think that these traits don't sound very nice or Seelie-oriented, something like being obsessed with love in all of its forms, and deciding to freeze a pair of mortals in the midst of their first kiss and abscond to them back to their castle in Arcadia, that's very Seelie of them. That is, if the intent of these actions is to preserve the beauty and purity of first love. And of course you can focus on actual good traits of any of these courts too, because one of these things that I really like about the nature aspect of courts is that all of these options have good and bad elements. Dark Ages Fey is another really good inspiration that has more of these positive aspects. I do think their idea of like Seelie, Unseelie courts are a little bit different though, but in Dark Ages Fey, the Spring Court is the court of catalysts. Fey who love mortals because they're agents of change and chaos and creativity. And they believe in order to survive, the Fey must constantly evolve. So they're a lot more Unseelie aligned in that one. But Fey like this might follow or stalk interesting mortals in order to study them. Kind of like naturalists. That way they can gather new ideas and take these innovations for themselves. Again, I highly recommend reading All Things Changeling. They have so much good stuff to shape any game involving Fey. But you can see here that I have my little cheat sheet for all of my different courts, with summer being preoccupied with glory, pride, and tradition, while also being potentially destructive and tyrannical. You have autumn being a court of knowledge. They're very studious, they're calculating and manipulative, but also mysterious and secretive, often using these talents to become embodiments of terror, of deep fears in the eyes of mortals. And then there's winter, being all about isolation, darkness, and emotional death, not depth. Very, very different. But their beliefs revolve around the idea of survival of the fittest, but also about rest and biding your time. But I think if you have the bug, it's fun to expand on these court ideas even more. Just in case you're not partial to not particularly well-written, but still addictive romantasy novels, I really like that in A Court of Thorns and Roses, there's the dawn, night, and day courts, these additional minor courts. But I think it could be fun to play with this idea or even have sub-courts within the courts, the major courts. Because you could have minor courts like the Court of Stars, that's astronomy related, or a seafoam court that's ocean themed. Whatever floats your boat. The important thing to remember though is when you're doing this is that Fey aren't like gods. Unlike gods where they're the ruler of a nature thing, of a concept, of an idea, they are the embodiment of a thing. They just are the truest form of something. And when we flesh out our Fey concepts, I'll talk about this a little bit more. But the important thing to think about when you're doing this with the courts is that Fey wouldn't control something like wind. They would be wind personified. But before we break down how to personify the Fey like this, we have to talk about the most misunderstood aspect of role-playing the Fey: blue and orange morality. If you're unfamiliar with this term, it's often used to describe a moral framework that exists in these other creatures like Fey and aliens and gods. It's just a framework that's so foreign to us mortals that we can't understand it and easily figure out how we can identify something as good or bad. How do we tell if these beings are evil or not? Evil or just misunderstood. I'm sure most of us are familiar with standard moral alignment, with characters being somewhere on a scale of good to evil, lawful to chaotic, but these touch points fly right out the window with Fey, which, you know, becomes somewhat of a problem when you need to have some sort of logic for how they act. So, how do we understand that which we cannot understand? Well, you can take your time and figure out the complex moral code your individual Fey might have based on their many varied allegiances. I have a quick and dirty way of doing this that lets me confidently act on behalf of any of the fair folk I might be role-playing as. And we still use the same sort of alignment structure. First, we replace good and evil with Seelie and Unseelie, because as we said earlier, these are not synonymous with each other, they're replacing them. So automatically one of the defining traits of how we play this Fey becomes whether they're more interested in preserving Fey traditions, in preserving honor, loyalty, beauty, protecting mortals, that sort of thing. Or are they more prone to self-interest? Do they crave change? Do they follow their passions and their whims? So is this Fey more bound by tradition or more of a wild card? But our other axis, this is our mystery axis, and it changes upon the individual Fey that are in your game. And if you like to keep little cheat sheets handy, you can make a general one based on the courts in your games, with one end having a potentially positive or helpful aspect of that court, and the other side having a potentially negative or harmful aspect of that court. But for Fey that you're going to be playing as a PC or that is going to be a reoccurring NPC, I like to assign this based on whatever individual sort of thing they're embodying. So let's take a sample from the Changeling sourcebook called Autumn Nightmares. Because again, even though I keep insisting that Fey aren't only bad and scary, these are always the ones I'm most drawn to personally. So I promise you can make these things nicer if you're not me. But there's these really weird Fey twins called Crumbcoat and Ganache. I did it, guys. I said Ganache and not Ganache, like a Chicagoan. But they're bakers and they specialize in really fucked up treats. Because in my experience, not many cakes require the use of a bone saw. Just my experience, though. So while I think there are situations where you could argue for these Fey being Seelie, if all of their food experiments were about upholding the beauty and decadence of Fey food, these two are very experimental and really want to push the boundaries. They're really about excess. So I'm going to say that they're Unseelie. But then this mystery axis is going to be a chef-themed axis. So as someone who spent a lot of time working in kitchens, I think a really good axis to think about their personalities and how they respond would be precision versus intuition. And I also think it's really fun to have each of the twins occupying one side of these. I love the mirror effect. But you could also think about having one of them be Seelie, the other Unseelie, and then one can be about something like purism, the other avant-gardism. You can definitely play with these sorts of ideas for as long as it's fun for you. But if we have Crumbcoat being on the precision side of things, he might be an NPC that has a lot of rigidity. He probably believes deeply in hierarchy, earning it though, not just by tradition. And he's probably someone who's very neurotic and strives for perfection. On the other hand, being more intuition aligned, Ganache might be prone to emotional outbursts, more prone to wild experimentation, and more likely to cause sudden bouts of chaos. So we already have a pretty decent list of traits that, when paired with a court that the Fey is aligned with, gives us a lot of depth and logic for these characters, but without making them easy to read, which is important. We can still keep people second guessing without making it feel like there's no rhyme or reason to what we're doing. And so the things we've already gone over, Seelie versus Unseelie, court alignment, and the flavor of blue and orange morality. All of that is enough to greatly improve the way you roleplay Fey already. But if you want to flesh them out just a little bit more, the last step is to really focus on their individuality, honing in on what smaller choices might influence the way that they behave. We might want to consider what potential Fey creatures they might be outside of the Archfey. Things like trolls, pixies, goblinoids, dryads, naiads, satyrs, nymphs. How might this creature type change the things they care about? How might it change the way their presence is received at court? Is their presence received at court? If it is, where are they in the hierarchy? Are they someone who has a chance to claw their way to the top? Or are they so far down that they don't have a lot to offer? But on the other side of that coin, they also might not have a lot to lose. Where are they aligned with their court, their faction? And where do their own goals potentially clash? What sorts of little touches can we give them based on their theme? Like, if a Fey is supposed to embody a breezy summer afternoon, why not play them in a way where some of their words get carried off as if on a wind? That way the players only get a good 80% of what they're being told. Naturally, they're missing some of the important bits. These little decisions go a long way to helping you kind of personalize and individualize your Fey. So now that we've laid out the different facets to consider when role-playing our Fey, let's build some out and talk about how we might bring them to life at the table. First, we'll finish off fleshing out Crumbcoat and Ganache, and then we'll create 2 new Fey. So we already decided that C and G are Unseelie. They belong to the Autumn Court, and Crumbcoat is precise while Ganache is intuitive. We have this nice list of traits already, but if we think about where they are in their court, we can continue to give them a little bit more depth. Let's say they have middling influence. Everyone agrees that they belong, but they're not quite impressive enough to be like court celebrities or anything. What's something that's holding them back then? C and G use trolls as workers in their kitchen. And a lot of true Fey are repulsed by that. So that can be a point of contention in their court. And while the Autumn Court values knowledge, and maybe in your game they're trying to accomplish something like distilling the spectrum of mortal emotions into different formats, maybe C and G really care about finding the ultimate recipe though. And maybe they believe this would come from distilling a half-Fey creature like a changeling. So they have this goal that might cause friction within the court. So now not only do we have this big list of potential traits that help us play these characters, because I'd play Crumbcoat as cold and exacting, frequently using scathing sarcasm, while playing Ganache as prone to flying off the handle, being someone that oscillates between exuberance and cruelty. But this also gives us things that PCs both want on a court level and also on a personal level, which means that if our PCs interact with them, we'll have an easier time deciding what would make them act in a way that's helpful and friendly, or ways that the party's goals could interact and overlap with theirs. Or not. So let's build another one. How about a true Fey inspired by an Anglerfish? We have the same steps as before. I'm gonna say this Fey is Seelie, and they're part of the Seafoam Court I talked about. We'll throw a minor court in. Since we haven't defined the Seafoam Court yet, I'm going to assign some quick traits to it. This is an ocean court, so we want to pull in both positive and negative aspects, things that the Fae can embody that are related to our perception of the ocean. So I'm gonna say this court is largely Unseelie, because there's 2 sides to the ocean really, right? You can have a Seelie one that's about wisdom, emotional depths, the collective, stability. But when I think about the ocean, I think about a raw force of power. I think of untamed beauty, of freedom, and things like passion and adaptation and big change. The things about the ocean that create that mix of awe and dread. I'm afraid of the ocean. And even though I'm thinking about the wilder aspects of the sea, this particular Fae still might be Seelie, because there's this weird little fun fact about the anglerfish that I wanted to incorporate into this idea. So this second aspect of theirs is going to be about symbiosis versus parasitism. And this was inspired by the fact that in real life, male anglerfish are really just these weird little like sex parasites. They end up permanently fusing their bodies to the larger female anglerfish. So the idea I had for this Fey, let's call her Lophii, is to be Seelie and symbiotic. In this case, meaning codependent. So I imagine that she lures mortals to her, and she does this using a more innocuous Fey creature, or even something that could be perceived as human as her lure, because they're one being appearing as two different entities. You can't see her yet. And so, like, she can speak herself, or she can speak through her little puppet, her puppet person. And now that I'm saying this, I'm pretty sure I actually have a similar concept in a different video as a monster somewhere. I just really like anglerfish. They're really cool. But maybe she's looking for her right person to keep forever. Players might not ever meet the real her, a large, terrifying, grotesque-looking Fey. But she keeps granting powers or protections in hopes that more mortals will slowly be ensnared by her. Maybe it's even the sort of thing where if a party relies on her a few times in a row, it switches from more of a giving stage to a taking stage. Because just like the idea of lawfulness versus chaos, this isn't meant to be prescriptive or static. You can't be all of one or all of the other. So maybe there's a way she starts slowly draining from the players, and this alignment switches to something more parasitic or draining. Again, because her goal is to find someone to keep, the right someone, and because we have these ideals she's trying to uphold. We can understand her. We can bring her to life because we can tell at which point she starts to become a danger to the players. We understand her traits, her methods, and her goals. And you don't have to start with a concept like a baker or an anglerfish, something high concept and abstract like this when you're thinking about your Fey. You can start with an archetype like I did when I was highlighting Seelie versus Unseelie. So let's say we start with the shepherd as our archetype. A shepherd would be someone more orderly, more traditional, more Seelie. And I associate them with summer, which we know comes with its own collective set of court traits. So they're proud, interested in glory, protective, and potentially hot-headed and destructive. And then I can think about the shape they'd take, the theme. And my mind goes right to herding dogs, but because this is about the Fey, I want it to be more majestic. I want them to be more wolf-like. Because big dogs are scary to sheep, right? They basically are wolves. So I want this Fey to be a little more imposing and to create this sense of tension. And so now that we have this Seelie wolf shepherd, what can we put on this other axis? I think a cool one for this character would be isolationist versus expansionist. So if they were on the isolation side, they might be more prone to believing that they need to create a sanctuary. But combined with these other traits, that might mean something like divorcing the flock from the rest of the world. No outsiders for you. And they might believe that freedom is really a danger. And if there's a rogue sheep, they need to be dragged back by force. But I think this one's on the expansionist side. So they believe the world should be their flock's oyster. A lot of animals in this metaphor. Again, because they're part of the summer court, this might mean they're pushing to patrol and conquer more land, expand where their flock grazes. And so they might be demanding of their flock, demanding that they grow in size and strength. They might spend time wiping out any predators or perceived potential threats, creating this almost nomadic warband as they roam throughout the Feywilds. Again, harkening back to this idea of them being wolf-like, and this idea of a shepherd archetype as kind of quiet and keeping to themselves. Maybe they barely communicate with others. Maybe it's largely through grunts and stares. And they might be more likely to attack first and ask questions later, if the threat is still alive, that is. So, hopefully all of this was helpful. If it was, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me all about the other cool Fey concepts you found, or other role-playing tips that have been helpful for you. And if you're going to GenCon, make sure to come say hi to me. I am not running 32 hours of games this year, but I am going to be doing a panel on TTRPG content creation with The Mind of Guy and Dash Gearhart. So if you've ever thought about starting up a channel of your own or getting into the TikTok and Instagram creator community, you definitely won't want to miss it. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out these ones next. Bye!